Welcome to the 9th episode of the Interstice Podcast. And I actually wrote down a few things today to discuss, have a little bit more of a roadmap than I might otherwise. First, of course, I want to say thanks to everybody who's watching, and a special thanks to everybody who's supporting me on Patreon. If you would consider supporting me on Patreon, that goes a long ways to the channel developing and me doing this one day full time, which would be great for creating way more content. Also wanted to mention that there is a new vid live on the channel, Top 5 Must-See Neighborhoods in Tokyo. Lots of love went into that. I hope you enjoyed if you check it out. So let's move on. So I'll start by saying I really like Stoic philosophy. And a lot of that it's going to relate to kind of the stuff that I've managed to create a sort of Japan-centric kind of topics around today. And one of my favorite books is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It's not that long. There's a couple of different translations you can get through pretty fast. And he was a student of there was a couple of big guys, a couple of big Stoa that were around in his time. There was a guy named Seneca. There's a guy named Epictetus. There's a guy, Marcus Aurelius, of course, he was one as well. And I was listening to some of the quotes of Epictetus the other day, and I really enjoyed this particular one. It's such great practical wisdom that these guys have. And incredible as well, I found that maybe it's the fact that there might be some kind of universal truth. I don't know. But I find that a lot of Stoic philosophy has like strange crossover connections in the way that they think to Zen and Taoist philosophy. Kind of interesting there, whole different topic. But anyway, so Epictetus has this phrase, and it's, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should listen twice as much as we speak. And I've had a few kind of like individual thoughts, and so I'll turn this into an anecdote and how it can be useful for you if you are somebody who is considering living in a foreign land, or maybe even for your own life, because it's always good to listen to people. So I've had to I'm moving soon because, as I mentioned in the previous episode, I have this new job, and that requires me finishing up where I live here, looking for a new apartment, and all of these kind of things. And this will be quite roundabout how we arrive to the conclusion of how all these things connect, but bear with me. That's why we got the whole podcast to discuss this. I had this other thought as well recently. I was outside being a bit of a dirtbag. I occasionally like to have a cigarette. And so I was smoking a cigarette. And as I arrived to the end of this cigarette, there's this storm drain that's near me, and I'm looking at that storm drain, and I'm thinking that normally what I would do is if I finished a cigarette, the storm drain feels like the most practical place that you would throw this. And I wondered why, because most obviously it just looks like a void. It's a black void. So I can throw it into there, and then it disappears. It's basically like throwing it into the ether. It's almost like I've made peace with the act that I'm going to litter. Not in a direct sense, like just onto the road. It's a little, one step better. It's into this drain, runoff thing. But it's because it's out of sight, out of mind. But then I got to thinking as I'm standing there with the cigarette, I'm thinking, but everything ends up somewhere. This is probably something we've heard before, like that you should think about a product life cycle, that when you use something and then you throw it away, it's going to end up somewhere. And I think that this is naturally comprehensible to us because it's material. And so it's not such of a stretch of the imagination for me. In fact, it's kind of practical to consider that when I throw this away, it's not just into a void in the ground. What's actually going to happen is that water in this runoff drain that I throw it into is going to carry this cigarette butt to somewhere that this isn't probably the best way to dispose of it. And so what I'm doing is creating a pollutant in my environment for not having cared more about the actions that I've taken. And the way that I thought about this then, I was considering relationships at the time and the different people in my life. And I thought, I bet you could apply the same reasoning to our relationships. Consider it love and hate. Let's use those two emotions. And I think that love and hate and the way that we treat people, just as we see in the natural environment, that all things must go somewhere. I think that, kind of to philosophize about this, I think that love and hate and each respective emotion goes somewhere. And it's easy for us, just like it's easy to look at a void in the ground and think that goes nowhere, it's especially easy for us to think that our emotional actions that we take go nowhere because they are immaterial. They are seemingly immaterial. But the truth of it is that when you're cruel, when you're inconsiderate, and equally so when you're kind, when you're just, when you treat people well, these don't simply get released from us and dissipate into nothingness. I think what's the concept of conservation of energy. I think of it almost like a conservation of the immaterial, that they go somewhere. Even if you've said it to yourself, you're still changing yourself by the things that we say and we do, self-adaptation. And it made me think more about just how important the actions that we take in our relationships are, and how if you have some festering negative relationship with somebody and that's out of sorts, then it probably is worth, for your sake and for your environment. You see, we're talking about polluting your environment with physical things, polluting your environment with mental waste, with things like hate and anger and bitterness and being cynical, I think is just as much a pollutant, although in a slightly different way. And how I was thinking about this in terms of relationships is, I guess what is Japan-centric for me is to think about, I had recently this, it's actually, I didn't mention this in the part of the story that I told on the podcast before, but I went out and I partied, and it was this wild night. It made for a fantastic story, I felt. But afterwards, I didn't talk about the fallout of that necessarily, where this is one of my greatest old man moments. I had pinched a nerve in my neck, and it's made going to the gym almost impossible. I may have herniated a disc where this right side of my body has gotten incredibly weak. It's really, really bad. But I needed to, for that reason, be going to the doctor. And there was this person that I needed to ask for help to do so. I didn't necessarily have to, because my Japanese is basically good enough to book appointments for these kind of things at the hospital or doctor, whoever it is that you might need to see. But in this one case, I thought, just in case there's some amount of complexity that I don't understand, it would be great to have somebody along with me. And so I requested this woman that I work with. I said, would you mind coming with me to the hospital? And I thought it was so easy, of course, because I'm dealing with this quite literal pain in my own life, pain and weakness in my own life. It's really easy to ignore the fact that somebody else could just as easily, song as old as time, we could become self-centered, and we don't think about the challenges of the people around us. And I thought, what I'm going to do is I'll try and counteract that. I'll try and not do that typical thing, which is to only consider my problems. And when I go to the hospital with this woman, I'm going to ask her, I'm going to make a concerted effort to ask her about her life and what's going on with her, and try as much as possible, much as I need to get this dealt with. And I mean, the trip is essentially about me. I'm going to try and get more of a window into her life for whatever reason, if only for I'm kind of philosophizing here that it's better. It's just better to behave in this way. And it was amazing to me speaking with her how once we got to the hospital and I started to, how incredibly forthcoming she was, and how much, I shouldn't be surprised, was going on in her life. And for this effort that I made, in the course of, a couple of different meetings and seeing a few different people at the hospital, how much closer we were at the very end of it. And I had this newfound respect for her, definitely a newfound respect for this kind of thought that I had that had sent me on this trajectory to speak to her and inquire about how her life is going. And like I've written here, it's like this really highlights, if you want to be treated well by people, treat them well. But I don't think that should necessarily be, like I've said, usefulness of people when you do this. But I don't think necessarily that should be the point, because then it becomes this act of, I don't think we can do anything entirely altruistically, but there's a great word for that. Altruistic love, or like something, agape or something. I was learning the different words for love in Greek recently. There's like 6 of them. It's awesome. But yeah, I thought that there should be some balance there, because you don't want to then make this discovery about, oh, it's really, really useful, because then people will help you with all your shit. and then it becomes like a manipulative thing and is really counter to the spirit of why you did it in the first place. So it's almost like that's a happy, what would you call it? Like collateral positive damage as a result of what you've done there. But it's worth noting, of course, that this only helps you. And I suppose what's interesting there to consider is it seems counterintuitive, where you're like, if I look after, because you have that idea, like, look after number one, you got to look out for number one. But actually, this would suggest that when you look out for others, you look out for number one, because you're going to have a stronger community around you, and that's ultimately going to help you far more, which is kind of ironic. That is interesting. It goes into like the next thing that I had. Like, I like this quote. You see these people around you who are apparently incredibly independent and strong. And one of the guys, like, he's incredible, is like Arnold, right? Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I really liked when I saw him in an interview, and he was talking about his success and how he was saying is like, there's no such thing. He's like, people talk to me and often compliment me, which is nice, saying that like, you're a self-made man. And he said that no, he hates that. He hates it when people use that expression, because he said, I wasn't self-made at all. He said, like, the relationship that I had with my mother when I was growing up was incredible. She's a great woman. And then he tells all these stories when he was at Gold's Gym in the States, and how kind everyone was to him there, and what like a priceless difference it made in his life overall, that people cared about him. And all of this stuff is useful in your everyday life, like I'm saying, but I think no more so could you see it be especially important than if you're going to do something like live in a foreign country, where in your native country, because you're so adept at navigating it, and you obviously have a native comprehension of the language, certainly this same kind of thinking, this same philosophy is going to help you out. But it certainly becomes much more important, basically, when you're not able to be quite so self-reliant. And as I say, I try and balance this between you don't want it simply to be that this is the method by which you can make use of people when you are not so self-reliant. I think there's an overarching importance to general life, but it certainly does help when you're living in Japan to live this way. The other thing I was thinking about recently, because I've had to move, or I am in the process of moving, and it's really important to me. Like, whether I like it or not, it's really important to me that I have to move, because if I don't, then suddenly I won't have a home. But I was thinking about because I've had to move, because I am moving, there are all these priorities that I usually have that I want to work on, but can't always now. For example, I'm always trying to work on the Japanese language, and since I've had that sort of derailed as a result of what I'm doing now with the new job and moving, that's sat in my mind. It's kind of a thorn in my mind right now where, I haven't been practicing Japanese nearly as enough as I should. And it could be no more present than when I'm doing these sort of necessary things while I'm moving that require much more Japanese, because you're speaking to real estate agents, you're canceling your utilities, all these things where I really, really need Japanese right now. And because I haven't practiced as much, I'm a little rusty when I'm speaking to them. And I found, here is this quote from, I really, really like this. I was listening to a bunch of these. I am not above just listening to like a list of like quotes from Epictetus or Marcus. I really like these. And it was a great focus for this idea when you're in this rut, you're in this, call it productive rut, creative rut. And it simply says like, begin is half the work, let half still remain, again begin this, and thou wilt finish. And it was a great reminder for me that it is okay if you have these moments where you are not able to have pedal to the metal. In fact, our culture, I think, does not give enough forgiveness for the fact that this may happen to us. And it creates a whole new kind of neuroses where, unless we're living an almost unsustainable amount, we're living out an unsustainable amount of productivity, then we're not happy with ourselves. But then that level of productivity is unsustainable in the face of the other things that we're going to have to face in our life. And so we should forgive ourselves the moments when we're not able to live quite so aggressively. I don't think that's the right word, but it'll serve for now, that it's okay when that happens. And to remind yourself, because you get this, there's an inertia to the work that we do. So the way that I was going to, again, kind of consider this in a Japan-centric way, say you're applying to come over here, whatever stage you are considering coming to Japan, maybe you're at the job searching stage. Maybe you're at the interview stage. Maybe you are accepted into a job or whatever else, but now there's a bunch of paperwork to do. If you find yourself at that moment where you are not progressing, then I feel like just start. That's all I'm taking from this. I thought, just because we always consider everything in its whole when we think of a project that we need to do. And that can be self-defeating, because to consider the full weight of an entire project so intimidates us that we don't want to start it. So think about really 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute, but start whatever it is that you need to do. And then it'll work itself out, because then, that begin is half the work, and then half may still remain. Let it remain. That's okay, but start it. And then again, begin this. The thought, I suppose, could be, I'm trying to focus on the idea of like, don't think of finishing it. Only think of starting every day. Whatever you need to do, start it. Just start it, and start it for whatever period of time that you can. Be that a long period of time, a short period of time. It doesn't matter. So long as you start to work on that thing that is causing you stress, aggravating you, worrying you for the fact that you've not been proactive. That's what I could have used earlier as opposed to aggressively living, proactively living. And I think that that's really cool. So it's like, I got written down here this, we're always facing these forever mountains, if you have any kind of aspirations. And by that, I mean, it's this thing that you're never going to summit, this thing that defies perfection. Now, you could see that a lot of people, there is no true, nor would you want to be utterly satisfied with your job. You're going to want to have like something cooler. I think where the sickness sets in, where we're not mentally healthy, is that none of this is necessary. It doesn't matter. There's nothing wrong with the desire to keep improving, but I think we should really reflect on how that's all self-imposed, and that so long as you're taking that action, then whatever degree of success or failure you're having, it should only be concluded from you, whatever that is. And how could I be clear about saying that? But basically, we are defining our success. And we should realize when we're being a little bit insanely strict with what that is. Again, kind of returning to this idea of like, just begin. Don't be your own worst enemy. Give yourself a break if you know that you have to for whatever other thing. Allow yourself time to evolve. I'm thinking again here, I'm trying to have patience with myself here to describe it. It's basically like, it's like this. There's nothing wrong with wanting to become the Ubermensch, the Superman, but realize that it's you that is judging yourself in failure if you haven't reached whatever you deem satisfying. And when you realize that, you're like, oh, it's just me, then you should be like, oh, if I'm the only one setting these standards for myself, then I should set them healthily. You know what all this sums up to basically? Don't beat yourself up. Set these goals, aspire to them, work on them hard, keep yourself accountable, but then don't self-flagellate, beat yourself to death if you're not achieving them. And I like I say, this can all relate to the kind of experience people could have while they're coming over to Japan. So the next thing, I cannot believe how quickly this first half of the podcast is gone. That's wild. Be aware. I wrote this down. This is something I saw recently. That I saw that I got this email. I get this. I don't know how I signed up for it, but it's a cool email, and it gives me information about different things that are going on YouTube. And this article was about how people on YouTube, that's how they made it a little bit clickbaity, was people on YouTube are getting diagnosed with PTSD, but it wasn't people on YouTube like content creators, although I bet some of them are. It was people who were having to filter the YouTube content that's uploaded. I was like, wow, that's really wild. But it made me think about modern algorithms and both their success in how they've designed them and the utter failure, the way that they really are. Well, they are simultaneously perfectly designed and at the same time perfectly designed to destroy you if you aren't using them in a conscientious way. And I thought about, how does this relate to Japan? How can I talk about that? Well, so basically, at first I should say what exactly it is that these algorithms are doing. So algorithms are, as much as they possibly can, serving you with what it is that you desire. That's their base principle, and everything that they're doing is working to that end. So what this means in a really positive situation, I'll start with the positive, because I think that sometimes too much focus is put on the PTSD. It's that if I get it in my head that I want to be a great artist, we've all experienced this before. If you click on or look up basic shading, you'll watch that one video, and then the very next day when you go to look at your feed, you'll be bombarded with incredible, insightful tutorials. You'll be like, wow, the algorithm has identified that you wanted this kind of content, and so it's going to serve it to you on a platter, and you'll see all these artists that inspire you. You'll have a wealth of information as only possible in the current age that we live, where you can self-educate, and it's absolutely wonderful. But conversely, the issue with this is humans are not one note. We don't exist as a emotionally static creature. We're up, we're down, and the problem is that when we have a down day, just as easily, we could look up something because we're in a brooding mood, and we look up something once, and it's a really negative video, probably something that we would be better without watching, but we want to pet our furry little hate creature, and so we click this video and we indulge ourselves in a little bit of like sadness, something that is not ultimately healthy for us. Now, the algorithm does not discriminate between you having a good day and you having a bad day, and so the very next day you're going to be served up an endless nonstop barrage of negativity because you made that choice the prior day. And how do I relate this to Japan? Well, I think about it when people go looking up horror stories, say they have a concern when they come over to Japan. They're like, oh, will Japan be like this? How do I deal with this if this happens in Japan? You know, a concern that they have. But then what's going to happen is all that's going to populate your feed now concerning Japan is negative information. And now, if we aren't discerning, if we aren't conscientious of the fact that this has occurred because of the algorithm, our now whole view of Japan is being shaped by what was really just a minor concern that we had is now our whole view of what Japan is like. So I really wanted to appeal to people, like, if you listen to this podcast, we're all going through these technological changes together, and it's tough out there if, as I say, you're not a conscientious user of these technologies, and that's really important. And I hope people are looking after themselves, not saying stay off social media. I'm saying be aware of how the systems work and use them for a positive force in your life, and be aware of when you feel like you're just being fed negativity. Because sometimes I look at that, my suggested feed on whatever social media, and it freaks me out. It means that I need to reset, look up some cool stuff, get outside of my box, and I would entreat people to do the same and be aware of how we are at the same time while we are being manipulated, we are manipulating ourselves as a result of how we interact with these things. All right, that wraps up the first half, and I've gotten wise. I finally created a questions folder. And now that will be separate, so I won't stumble through in the second half of the podcast trying to determine who wrote me. It's going to go much smoother. I'm quite proud of this new evolution. So here we are with the questions up, ready to go. I wanted to mention again, trying to make this as interactive as possible. I love getting these emails, and if you want to have your email answered on the Interstice Podcast, please do write me at davetrippanon@gmail.com. That email address is available if it didn't quite make sense here. If you're listening on Spotify or iTunes, on my YouTube channel, Dave Trippin, send me an email and I would love to discuss it here on the podcast. So where in the past I said, oh, let's cut down the length of these things. No, not so, not anymore. We are going to, with the emails I receive, we're going to go through the whole thing. And I think this will be fun. So, first up, this comes from John Ramage. Okay, dear Dave, your videos interest me because I've lived in Japan myself. That's cool. It's nice to listen to other people's experiences. In a recent interview, you spoke about how Interact is very risk averse and wants people to stick rigidly to the contract and avoid club activities at school. Well, I'd agree that Interact is risk averse, but when I was with them, Interact trainer Dan emphatically wanted us to do more, all in caps, than the contract said. So we were able to go to all club activities, that's unusual, come to school super early and leave after 5. Dan was a little over the top. Okay. By the way, I am using assumed names here. My time with Interact ended some years ago, but I would appreciate if you could give me some feedback on the weird situations I was in. Okay, this sounds juicy. I felt under a lot of pressure at Interact. I had many very positive, exciting experiences when in Japan, but there were difficulties too. Maybe you could create a video about some of the questions raised here. That's what this is, John. We're doing it in the podcast. Interact's orientation was amazing. It was far better than the very low-key orientation I had in South Korea. Interesting. It was amazing because of the wonderful people and engaging personalities I met in the first week in Japan. Some of these people became good friends of mine. I was also impressed by the fact that Interact's training included lots of activities for use in classes with little children. There were lots of lively games and word practice activities. The problem was I was going to a high school. By no means all the games would be relevant. That's fair. My feelings seriously nosedived when I finally got to the high school in Fukushima Prefecture. I am reminded of a Chinese saying, Long Tao Shi Wei, awesome, which means a dragon's head with a snake's tail, which is an amazingly auspicious start followed by a disappointing ending. That's my experience with Interact. Okay. When I got to high school, there were some shocks. Shock number one was that the English games weren't quite right for high school. I felt under enormous pressure to perform, but I had no idea. Performance anxiety, I see. I had no idea what to do other than the kids' games, kids in brackets here. I could have called Interact to get them to help me clarify this, but I felt ashamed to admit defeat. There's no shame in asking for help. That's the whole, there is no self-made man we were talking about in the first part. It's okay. We're to be independent. I remember I was going to talk about something else here at the beginning and I forgot it. Anyways, I'm derailing the email. Let's get back to this. I was going to be ashamed. There was a shock. Okay, I didn't want to admit defeat. Meanwhile, there were 2 other ALTs at the high school, and they were determined to go the extra mile, and they seemed positively besotted with Interact. The attitude of one of them was, this is amazing. This is simply, all caps, amazing. It really doesn't get better than this. I felt I was being outflanked. I felt huge pressure, working 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and sometimes more in that atmosphere. It could be something small, such as them changing the indoor shoes in a flash, whilst I needed a few minutes, making me seem slow. One of the departing ALTs had been a jet teacher. His attitude was irreverent and so refreshing. Interact is full of BS, ha ha ha. That still makes me laugh. He talks about doing time in Fukushima-ken. I noted that lots of money was being spent on the high school, so they wanted fast results. There was a rumor of money laundering or money from corruption being invested in school. Interesting. Another corrupt money being invested in a school? That's not usually where corrupt money goes. Maybe I've misunderstood. Another surprise was the following as part of my job. I was required to go to middle schools in other towns, Sachiko, and drum up business for the high school. I was told that otherwise the middle school kids might choose to go elsewhere. Again, there was huge pressure to perform. I was to get up super early due to rush hour traffic. I now needed to leave this is an epic email, for the middle school at 6:20 p.m. I'd be late. The early start would bother me less now, but the atmosphere was already strained. When I arrived, things would be odd. There would be 2 jets and 2 ALTs in the classroom. One of them was a jet teacher. Sometimes the crowd would get even bigger. That is strange. Another surprise was that a TV crew came to interview me. That is strange. One day, the inspectors knocked at the high school gates. They came to Mr. Sakamoto's class. Sakamoto was the kind of super competent or omnicompetent teacher you would plan classes to exclude the ALTs. Oh, okay, he just didn't need anything. I don't necessarily think this was malicious, but the inspectors had arrived. I was in his class, and there was nothing to do. Apparently, the 2 other ALTs had raised and lowered their arms at strategic points in the lesson. That was all they did. I was accused of doing nothing. Things reached a low point. Dan from Interact appeared. I explained the situation. We agreed that I would patch things up with the other ALTs and we'd clarify my role. The strategy worked quite well. In fact, everyone at school forgave me and I forgave them. We were able to work together more efficiently. I now knew what I was to do, and there was a marked improvement in my performance. One of the 2 high points, Mr. Sakamoto invited us to dinner at his beautiful traditional Japanese house by the sea. I got to meet his family, and we had plenty to eat and to drink, and it was a very beautiful Saturday. Another high point was the school excursion to the aquarium. One day, Dan from Interact returned. He had bad news. Interact was very happy to keep me on. How was this bad? The school was very happy to keep me on, but the Board of Education wanted another teacher even if my situation had improved. Apparently they had been told of my improvement, but would not listen. You got screwed by your Board of Education. That's fascinating. So I went to Tokyo and teach in an eikaiwa, and my adventures began again. Interact, this is like Gulliver's Travels Japanese version. You're surrounded by little people. These are the Lilliputians. Interact kindly gave me deposits and severance pay from Interact. What? I had to pay key money twice in 1 year. Ooh, and that dug into my savings. What can I say, though? Is that if the BOE had been happy to keep me on, I had received my salary and was able to calculate that in the rural province I was saving money. Yes, after the first 2 months I would be saving money, which is an advantage of life in rural Japan. I tend to think now that I experienced a severe culture shock in Fukushima. If I had gotten over it quickly, I'd have saved more money and continued learning Japanese. I did anyway. I continued to learn kanji, and in Tokyo I memorized a ton of them. Had I kept the job with Interact, I might have had more security, but who knows for sure. It would be nice if you could give me some feedback on the experiences. How unusual is it to be in this kind of situation in a Japanese high school with multiple ALTs? What can be said about high schools? There's a lot of talk about elementary school kids on the internet, but I perceived Asian high school kids as being quite different from the norm, as a non-standard in some ways. Might you be willing to prepare a video about teaching in Japanese high schools? If I had taught in a Japanese high school, certainly I would, but I haven't, so I can't. But I can speak to your situation here in that I've said this over the years, that there's sort of a typical formula to the experience you probably have, I guess closest to that I would be aware of is junior high school. But you really do need to remind yourself to prevent, what would I say? Don't be shocked by the unexpected. I think that's another reason why I think like glutting yourself on YouTube videos and creating a pre-narrative to the experience that you will have here is a really, really dangerous thing to do, because you never know what kind of madness, be it wonderful or horrible, that you're going to encounter when you come over here, where I don't think I have ever heard of so many ALTs all like... I know two, sure, there's two. I will sometimes team teach with other teachers, and it's a very like assistant role, very much an assistant role. And so that'll mean that there's the homeroom teacher, the English teacher, and then me who's come to assist, but never with more than that. But to hear that you've had that experience doesn't really surprise me. And these kind of things are happening all the time. I mean, one of the ones that I've noticed where people, again, it shouldn't shock them, but classes are changed and flipped around and canceled all the time. And you should be aware of that, or not so much even aware of it as that when you see these forks in the road, that you kind of take them on, water off a duck's back. You don't let it get to you, because the experience here is rife with spontaneous moments of change and unusualness, and we are far better off to simply roll with them rather than to make it a sticking point where if you're irritated or put some personal stake in the fact that somebody has canceled a class or comes in late, then there's not much that you can do. And to be aggravated by then, to kind of hold that within yourself, is only going to build up frustration, cynical view of your experience, and it does you no service, even if you need to change things to hold that aggravation. And so better that if you do need to change something, or like had occurred with you here, if something like this comes up, you simply do what you need to do, and as much as possible mitigate the strong negative emotional reaction that might be knee-jerk when that kind of thing occurs. Although I'm not without compassion when I hear something like that, like you had done everything well, it was in this bizarre circumstance that you looked so bad to the Board of Education, and then they were merciless, unforgivable in how they handled you afterwards. That sucks. I don't think ignoring suffering and not acknowledging it, then you become like this toxically positive person who's like just all smiles and is manic, and obviously life's not all sunshine and rainbows. But well, at the same time, acknowledging that this sucks, this was a difficult thing to have experienced, get on with it, and acknowledge the pain, but get on with it. That's my kind of thought. That was an awesome email to read through, John. Thank you very much for that. Okay, next up. Okay, cool. So this is actually, I said, patrons, especially if you're supporting me on Patreon, definitely write me. I will absolutely be answering your questions. So this is from Jesse. Dave, thanks for the YouTube channel. Right on. Browse a lot of channels. Good information. That's cool. I have a question that I think would be good for your podcast. Okay. In January, I'm moving to Osaka to be an English instructor with Nova. My ultimate goal is to navigate their training program in a way which would best prepare me for a job teaching English to business professionals. While browsing Gaijinpot and Ohio Sensei, I have seen jobs in this niche field which pay quite handsomely. Could this work as a legitimate career? Do you know anyone who has done anything similar? Also, I wanted to ask about raising a family in Japan. Currently, I am single, but I would like to get married within and start a family. So start a family relatively soon. How feasible is this in Japan? I don't have any issues attracting women. Well done, Jesse. Well done. Also keep in mind that I would have this goal whether I was living in Japan or not. Yeah, that's fair. I'm not going there specifically to marry a Japanese woman. Sure, you want a family, and women are, equal parts to that equation. So it's cool. Let's see. I downloaded HelloTalk. Sure, that's a good way to meet people. It has proven to be a great resource. Very cool. Now, when I arrive in Osaka, there are 3 different women who want to meet me. I'd suggest this app to anyone going to Japan, sure, who would like some guidance upon arrival. Using another app called Duolingo has gotten me to the point where I can read all hiragana, katakana, and some kanji in less than a month. That's awesome. I'd suggest this to anyone struggling with the endeavor. Hopefully this message isn't too long to be addressed in the podcast. So, yeah, talking about legitimate careers in Japan, specifically this call it niche field of business English. I think that you could absolutely make a career of this. And there's a number of branching paths. There's one that's really, really obvious where Japanese businesses now absolutely have global, the GDI, the Global Defense Initiative. No, they have global initiatives, or I call it like international initiatives, where Japanese companies don't want to get left behind. They know how much business is done in English. And so many, many companies are having an initiative to have English spoken more, to have more internationally or English capable speakers in their companies. And they'll put on these like workshops in their companies to try and become more international, become more able to speak English. And so if your Japanese was quite good and you wanted to like get really integrated with one of these companies, that's one way to do it. You could be like the person who organizes the workshops around like their English speaking goals that they have in the company. You'd need a really high level of Japanese for that. There's going to be tons of like freelance work that you could do, I'm sure, for business level, we call it English business, business professionals that want to speak English. There's lots of freelance work for that. I think that it's also one of the classic ways that if you go and you're really committed to the teaching and English path is how you want to create a living and aspire to something more here in Japan, having your own school is a great way to do that. And having business professional English clients is a great way to do that, because there's a lot to be said for adult students. Adult students are much more usually proactive, and they're like a willing student, say, for example, whereas a kid is often being sent there, and maybe they enjoy it, but maybe they don't. So business professionals are often great people to work with because of the desire that they have. So it can be we're trying to think, how do I get this kid to enjoy English? The fact that you won't be stressed out by considering that aspect of it is really, really useful. So freelance work is good. Using it as a kind of, you're opening a school where you've already got this job, say like you're doing part-time teaching to business professionals, is really good. If your Japanese is good enough, then maybe you can actually like take on the role of somebody in one of these companies who's looking to, in their human resources, basically have like an international initiative. There's a couple of different options. Now, I guess the other one was, I also wanted to ask about raising a family in Japan. So there's a couple of things that I've learned recently that are particular. There's some particular things here. So I believe that, and it relates specifically to children, what I'll talk about. So if you marry a Japanese national, because your child is related to Japan in that way, there is a large amount of assistance given to Japanese nationals, people with like that passport, in terms of education. And so it's something that you want to consider, where on the one hand, if you use the public school system and your wife or husband is Japanese, then you're going to save a huge amount of money. Whereas if your, if your spouse is not a Japanese national, then the schooling, the cost of raising your children is essentially going to be much greater. Not that it becomes impossible, but it is definitely something that you should consider. If you were to be doing the adulting and you were making a budget for yourself, you would think, okay, so my child will be a Japanese citizen, or they will not. And then that is going to affect my finances. Perhaps you have an incredibly successful school at this point. You were rolling in tens and millions of yens, and so you won't need to worry so much. But for the rest of us workaday peons, it's an important thing to consider with the family. Where I felt like that's kind of the only thing I would say, though, regarding like, can you raise a family here? Because you're a human being. Everybody fits in with somebody else. Even Warp Speed Ugly will find another Warp Speed Ugly person, and they'll create beautiful Warp Speed Ugly babies together. And so I don't think finding a relationship here isn't any more difficult or easy than anywhere else in the world. Lots of people want families. Everybody's looking for a connection, nearly, I would say. So there you go. Thanks very much for your question, and thanks very much for supporting me on Patreon, Jesse. I really appreciate that. Okay, let's go to the next one. This comes from David, another David, beloved. I hope, I think I actually, no, I responded to this one. Whoops, that could have been bad. Do that again. Okay, so here we go. This comes from Reese. So Reese says, hi, Dave. First of all, watching the videos. That's awesome. Appreciate the content. Sweet. Okay, that's great. I lack in the field of life experience as a senior in university. Sure. However, I really think that attitude will get you far in life. Completely agree. Perspective, attitude, by another name. You do great work. Anyways, as for my question, I have two that are really one and the same. You see, I am soon to graduate with a degree in secondary science education, as I am currently a full-time student teaching. I've desired to teach in Southeast Asia for some time, more specifically Japan, and was wondering how possible would it be to teach English and or science in a Japanese school system, having taught in the public education sphere and now soon to be private. Congratulations. Thanks. I figured you might have some insight into this. If teaching science is an unlikely option, do you believe that assisting a science teacher, maybe things like student lab, or might be a possibility? Teaching English would definitely still be fun for me, but science is my first joy, which I'd like to continue pursuing. As always, I appreciate the honesty, and best of luck. Thank you very much. Many thanks, Reese. Okay, great question. And the answer is yes, Reese. I actually know a person just like yourself, lovely Filipino lady, who is the wife of a man that I worked with recently. And her background was in science. And I know that she has been hired by a Japanese private school specifically to teach English there. It might be an international Japanese private school, but ultimately the point which is valuable for you to take away from this is that you could totally, with your teaching license and your experience in Japan, still teach that subject. Granted, it's going to be a little more complex because, well, you probably teach that subject in English. And so it would need to be, as I say, like an international school or a private school that has like an English initiative for science. So finding these jobs is a little bit more challenging because statistically speaking, there are not so many of them, but they do exist. They absolutely exist. And you would be able to follow your desires here and see success with that. So a great question, because I don't know that this is one that people are considering that often. They think that the only thing that you could teach here is English, and it's not. I used to say when people asked me, oh, could you do like music and stuff? And I said, no. But more and more, when I've looked around at the jobs that are available, there is actually quite a market, if you're diligently watching for it, to teach different subjects in Japan. So that's something to totally watch out for. I want to circle back to what I was talking about earlier, talking about there's no such thing as a self-made man because they're getting so much help from people. Independence is important, but help is okay too. A way I was thinking about this, capping off the podcast here, if you're living in Japan, let's put it this way. So I'll relate this anecdotal story from today. So there are some situations where you just can't be as proactive as you want to be, but the important thing is to identify when you have a chance to be more independent to do that. Accept that there are certain situations where you simply can't and ask for help, but when you do see an opportunity or you do see a situation where you could do this yourself, then do it. So the anecdotal story that I'll tell for this is basically moving between houses. I'm okay. My Japanese, as people know on this channel, I'm working on it. I'm never going to give up. Never going to give you up. And be that as it may, there's definitely a lot of vocabulary I'm not good with, and a lot of everything. I have a long way to go. And so I invited my friend out, great guy. He came to support me while I was going to the travel agent. And then today and there's an example where there's just things that were said at the travel agent that I do not know. And it was great to have him there, and I'm eternally grateful for. But then the next day, the plan was that I should go to my current address as real estate agent and say, hey, I'm going to move out of here soon. Again, he would help me. Now, he phoned me in the morning and he said, probably better that we would contact them first at the real estate agent for my current address and let them know that I intend to move before we even go into the shop, because it's about a 30-minute drive out there, and why not have the paperwork ready? And so this was a point where there was the coward inside me that thought, oh, well, can't he just phone them because the phone is so intimidating? The truth of it is, though, that it's not so much at my level now. Yes, of course I can give a call. Are there going to be needed? Are there points where I'll require extra clarification and say, slow down a bit what you're saying, things like this? Absolutely. But do I need to offload that responsibility to him? No. And so when he said to do that, I was like, okay, I'm going to man up. And I called him up, and I discovered that I don't actually even need to go in. They said that there's a number that you would call. And I call that number, and then the number said that there's another number you can call, and I called that number and I sorted it out. And so now I've arranged for when I will leave. But the point was that at first it was all right. I had requested him that the situation was I needed a little assistance because things are going to be said that I don't understand. He says, no problem. But then when your friend suggests to you that this is where you got to pick the ball up and run, be willing to do that. And you'll be much happier on the other side of it because you'll have done it yourself. You had a chance to grow, to learn. And so really start to look for those moments where, is this really a moment that I need help, or is this an opportunity to grow my independence here in the country? And always be looking for those opportunities. They're going to be hard. I'm trying to make that point here that it's in the face of discomfort that you have to make them. So it's always a tough choice. That's the whole point. It's a choice that is difficult, but because it's difficult, you get the most gains from it, which is great. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. I really appreciate you tuning in. Leave a comment if you're watching on on the channel. Thanks on Spotify or iTunes, wherever that you might be. Thank you very much to the patrons. Again, to give myself the chance at the end here, if you would consider supporting me on Patreon, that goes a massive way to the channel's growth, improvement, and eventual full-time being able to commit to creating content for you guys, which I love to do. Eternally grateful. This was a lot of fun. Watch for the podcast in the sky coming soon. Number 10. That's all for now. The clock has run out.